So over the last 18 months, you'll all know we have been living through really extraordinary times. But I think the story that I'm going to talk to you about tonight has got many parallels for us today. I'm going to talk for about 40 minutes about the story of Endell Street Military Hospital and how I came to write it. And then I'm very happy to answer any questions. So my background is I'm a journalist by training. I've spent most of my career writing about health and medical services. I've also written 5 non-fiction books, and they're all based on true stories from medical and social history. And often when I talk about my books, the first question people ask me is, and somebody's already asked me this before we even started, how did I come across the story? So what was the inspiration for the book? And usually the answer is quite dull. There's no eureka moment. But with Endell Street, there really was a dramatic moment of discovery. Because some years ago, when I was looking for the next idea for my next book, I walked into the Wellcome Library for the History of Medicine in Euston Road, and I saw a painting on the wall. And it was this painting. And I did a double take because, first of all, it's a very large and very stunning picture, a very beautiful picture. But secondly, because it's rare enough even today to see an operating theatre where all the doctors are female. Women currently make up 48% of the medical workforce in the UK. So we are at the tipping point where women are almost at equal numbers with men in the medical profession. But women are still underrepresented in many areas, including surgery. Currently, 88% of surgeons in the UK are male. But then I discovered that this picture shows an operating theatre in a military hospital in the First World War that was completely run and staffed by women, Endell Street Military Hospital. And I was amazed that the hospital wasn't better known. I'd never heard of it before. And so I embarked on a journey to find out all about it and to bring that story to life. Endell Street was unique. It was the only military hospital under the auspices of the British Army to be run and staffed by women. Throughout the First World War, the women at Endell Street treated wounded soldiers sent back from every war zone, from France, from Gallipoli, from everywhere. And the story of how the hospital came about is a remarkable example of courage, determination, and stamina, which I think still speaks volumes to us today. Well, when war broke out in August 1914, thousands of men signed up to fight. And women signed up in their thousands too, as volunteers in every capacity. Women worked on the land, in factories, and on public transport, like the conductorette, as she was known, on a bus in the Strand. And naturally enough, women doctors volunteered too. So within 10 days of war being declared, more than 60 women doctors had put their names forward to the War Office. But they were not wanted. Their help was bluntly rejected. One doctor, a Scottish surgeon called Elsie Ingalls, she volunteered her services to the army in Scotland, and she was rebuffed with the words, "My good lady, go home and sit still." Well, Flora Murray and Louisa Garrett Anderson were not the kind of women to go home and sit still. They were both qualified doctors. They had more than 10 years experience each. Louisa, who was 41 at the start of the war, was a surgeon. Flora, who was 4 years older, was a physician and anaesthetist. They had both originally trained at the London School of Medicine for Women, although Flora finished her medical education at Durham University. But despite the fact that their qualifications were exactly identical to their male colleagues, they were restricted to treating only women and children. So women in the UK had won the right to qualify in medicine several decades earlier. In fact, it was Louisa's mother, Elizabeth Garrett Anderson, who had become the first woman to qualify in Britain to join the medical register in 1865. But nearly 50 years later, at the start of the First World War, women doctors were still confined to treating women and children. So by this point, there were roughly 1,000 women doctors in the UK, but the vast majority of them had qualified, like Flora and Louisa, at the London School of Medicine for Women, for the simple reason that most medical schools, and in fact all of those in London, refused to admit women. So no jobs in the big general hospitals were given to women doctors because the all-male boards always appointed men. It was taboo for women doctors to treat men, even though, of course, nurses were treating men all the time, and women very rarely worked in surgery. So Flora and Louisa worked in hospitals set up and run by women to treat women and children. Louisa worked as a surgeon at the new hospital for women, which had originally been set up by her mother. You may have heard of it. It became known later as the Elizabeth Garrett Anderson Hospital, and it was quite recently subsumed into University College Hospital. Flora worked in hospitals in South London for women and children. And together they ran a small, very small 7-bed hospital for children in a poor area of London. So the picture on the left shows Flora in the middle of a very crowded outpatients department. Well, given the prejudice that they had faced, it's hardly surprising they had both joined the suffragettes. Louisa served 4 weeks in Holloway Prison for smashing a window, and the picture on the right shows her on a suffragette march with her mother. But Flora took even more daring action. She was Mrs. Pankhurst's doctor. She was known as the honorary doctor to the suffragettes, and she campaigned vociferously against the force feeding of suffragettes in prison by prison doctors. She treated many of the suffragettes for the ill effects of force feeding at a nursing home that she ran in West London. And she even helped some of those suffragettes to evade being arrested or rearrested by the police. She helped them to escape so they weren't sent back to prison. So in early 1914, just before the war broke out, they were both under surveillance by Scotland Yard. So they both put their professional careers on the line for the suffragette cause. And they were also life partners. Flora and Louisa were absolutely devoted to each other. They wore identical diamond rings and they lived together in the manner of a married couple. Flora described Louisa as my loving comrade. So they had stood shoulder to shoulder in the women's battle for equality. But when the war broke out, the suffragettes and the suffragists suspended their campaign for the vote in order to join the fight against the common enemy and support the war effort. Flora Murray and Louisa Garrett Anderson were just as keen as their male colleagues to support the war effort, to serve their country and to treat the wounded. But they also saw war as an opportunity. It was a chance to prove that women doctors were equal to their male colleagues. So they didn't waste time approaching the army. They knew they would be rejected. As active suffragettes, they were effectively public enemies. Instead, just 8 days after the outbreak of war, they offered their help to the French Red Cross, who were more than happy to accept. And within a fortnight, they had raised £2,000 for equipment and medical supplies. So that's roughly £200,000 today. They had recruited a team of like-minded women and they kitted themselves all out in military style uniform. And then on the 15th of September, so just 6 weeks after the outbreak of war, they set off with their team for France. They named their unit the Women's Hospital Corps. And in addition to Flora and Louisa, there were 3 more women doctors and 2 more also came out later. 8 nurses, and more nurses also came out later to join them, and 3 women orderlies. Plus they had 4 male helpers, 4 male nurses. When they arrived in Paris, they were given an empty luxury hotel, the Hotel Claridge in the Champs-Élysées. And the picture shows them on the steps of the internal courtyard, the kind of atrium. You can see a patient in his bed in the background there. That atrium still exists. The hotel's still there in the Champs-Élysées. At the time, it was brand new and never actually had opened. And within 48 hours, the women had scrubbed the floors, set up camp beds, and converted the hotel into a 100-bed emergency hospital. So we've come to know in recent times the campaign to set up the Nightingale hospitals, which happened very quickly in a few weeks, but they turned their hotel into a hospital within 48 hours. They turned the stylish salons and the dining rooms into their wards. The ladies' cloakroom was converted into their operating theatre, which you can see in the picture on the right. And the hotel grill room, which had originally been designed for wealthy guests to linger over steak and claret, that became the mortuary. And then just 2 days after taking possession of Claridge's, the wounded began pouring in. They were British and French soldiers from the front line, which was at the time roughly 60 miles north of Paris. Most of them needed urgent surgery. Some of them had come straight from the battlefield. Others had been left for several days at a time with their wounds untended at little railway stations outside Paris. As women doctors, they were, of course, extremely, even dangerously inexperienced. They had no experience of military surgery. They had very little experience of major surgery at all. And they had never previously treated men. But they learned fast, they had to, and in any case, the wounds that they had to treat were unprecedented. So no doctors, male or female, had previously encountered the scale of casualties and the extent of wounds that the First World War unleashed. The men arrived at Claridge's with huge, gaping, ragged wounds. They had complex compound fractures where the broken bone emerged through the skin. They had wounds from shrapnel, which left dozens of fragments of bone in bones and muscles. And there were many head injuries in the early days of the war before the army realised it might be quite useful if the men had steel helmets. And even worse, most of the wounds were heavily infected with gangrene. So they had extensive gangrene caused by the microbes in the manured soil of northern France. And some of the patients were already showing signs of shell shock. Well, to begin with, army chiefs and army officers who came to visit Claridge's so they could see this novelty of a hospital run by women, they were at first very hostile and even downright opposed to what they were doing. But then they toured the hospital and they watched the women in the operating theatre and they spoke to the patients, and they were quickly converted and they became strong allies and advocates for the women's work. So 2 months later, in November 1914, Flora and Louisa opened a second hospital in a small hotel, the Chateau Mauricienne in Wimereux, about 4 miles from Boulogne. And the postcard shows the hotel in more tranquil times. That hotel also still exists, it's still there. And this time the army gave them official status. So they got their rations and their equipment provided by the army. Their patients came through the army evacuation chains. So the Chateau Mauricienne effectively became the first hospital staffed by women to operate under army auspices. And there they treated the wounded from the First Battle of Ypres, who arrived daily in ambulance trains at Boulogne. And then in early 1915, Murray and Anderson were invited to a meeting at the War Office in London with Sir Alfred Keogh, the head of the Royal Army Medical Corps. Keogh was well aware, despite some of the early optimists, that the war was going to continue for many more years. He knew he was going to need lots more beds on the home front in Britain. And he'd heard about Flora and Louisa's work from his colleagues in France. He'd heard it praised by his army chiefs there. So he now asked them if they would run a major military hospital in the heart of London. And it was an astonishing request, but they accepted immediately. They knew this was their real chance to prove that women doctors were every bit as skilled as their male colleagues. So they closed the 2 hospitals in France and they moved back to London straight away. Endell Street Military Hospital opened in May 1915 in a former workhouse, St Giles and St George's in Covent Garden. It had 520 beds, and that was later increased to 573 in 17 wards. And all the wards were named after female saints. It was, and it would remain, the only hospital within the British Army to be run and staffed by women. Apart from 22 male RAMC orderlies, and you can see them just about on the right hand side of that picture, and that number was later reduced to just 8. All of its 180 staff were women. There were 14 doctors, so that's 14 doctors' posts. Altogether, there were about 40 different women doctors who worked at Endell Street throughout the war. They included surgeons, physicians, anaesthetists, radiologists, a pathologist, an ophthalmologist and a dental surgeon. Most of those women doctors had trained, like Flora and Louisa, at the London School of Medicine for Women, although some came from overseas. There were 4 doctors, 4 surgeons who came from Australia and 1 from Canada expressly to work at Endell Street in the war. Flora Murray was the chief physician and medical director, so she was in charge of running the hospital. Louisa Garrett Anderson was the chief surgeon. You can see them in the middle of that picture with one of their 2 dogs. They had black and white dogs. There were 29 qualified nurses, so not very many really for 17 wards, but more than 80 women orderlies. So those are the majority of the women in that picture. In fact, it was the orderlies who did most of the work. So they were nursing assistants, and many of them were really doing basic nursing work. They were often left in charge of wards on their own at night. They were also stretcher bearers, cooks, cleaners, clerks, every job in the hospital. Many of them were young, middle or upper class women who had previously led lives of leisure. Most of them had never really boiled an egg before, let alone emptied a bedpan. Some of them were dropped off at the gates of Endell Street every morning in chauffeur-driven cars. But regardless of their background, all the women wore the same Endell Street uniform. They were awarded army pay and allowances, and they were given honorary military rank. So they were not officially in the army, but they were given ranks equivalent. And Murray and Anderson became the equivalent of majors, and Murray was later promoted to be the equivalent of a lieutenant colonel. Endell Street was on the front line of the capital's wartime medical care. Ultimately, there were more than 300 hospitals in London receiving wounded soldiers in various capacities, but they ranged from the major general hospitals to very little nursing homes. But Endell Street was one of the 20 largest military hospitals in London, and within central London, it was one of the biggest 10. Because of its proximity to Charing Cross Hospital, where the wounded were arriving by ambulance train, it received the most serious cases. The convoys of wounded usually arrived in the middle of the night, and the imminent arrival of a convoy would be announced by a bell ringing twice in the courtyard. And then the women, the orderlies who were on duty, who lived on the hospital site, they would hurriedly get dressed, they'd pull their uniforms on over their night dresses, and they'd rush down to stand to attention in the courtyard. And then the ambulances rolled in. They were mostly driven by women drivers, as you can see in the photograph. And the men would be unloaded by women stretcher bearers from the ambulance, as you can see from the photograph. Well, Endell Street was really regarded as a huge gamble. When Sir Alfred Keogh came up with his plan, he was warned it would be a failure. His colleagues, other army chiefs, told him that Endell Street would not survive 6 months. And in fact, the War Office were as unhelpful as possible. They put every obstacle in the women's way. And yet the hospital not only survived 6 months, it was hailed a triumph. To begin with, some of those wounded men who were unloaded in the courtyard from those ambulances, they were so shocked at being surrounded by women doctors that they thought they had been sent there to die, because that was the only explanation they could come up with for being sent to a hospital run by women. But very quickly, they not only accepted the women staff and the women doctors, but they decided that theirs was the best hospital in London and they were the best doctors. And the newspapers reacted similarly. At first, the press treated Endell Street as really a curiosity, and many of the early news reports were frivolous or even incredulous. But that soon changed, and Endell Street was frequently featured in the newspapers as an example of the Blighty fighting spirit. The Suffragettes Hospital, as it was known, was described in the newspapers as the most popular and the most successful in London. Endell Street became renowned for its efficient organisation and professional care. The staff treated more than 26,000 wounded throughout the war. The vast majority of those were men, but there were also about 2,000 women who joined up in the later years in the services, in the WACs, the Wrens and the RAFs, who were also treated at Endell Street. The doctors at Endell Street performed more than 7,000 major operations and many more minor ones, often operating 8 or 9 hours a day. And they introduced pioneering treatments. They were in the vanguard in championing X-rays and physiotherapy and occupational therapy, which were all novel specialties at the start of the war. And they also pioneered a new method of wound treatment. In 1916, Louisa Garrett Anderson and the Endell Street pathologist Helen Chambers trialled a new antiseptic ointment to tackle the severely infected wounds that they saw. The ointment was called bismuth iodoform paraffin paste, or BIP for short, I'm glad to say. And they found that it not only healed the wounds better than other antiseptic ointments they were using, but it needed far fewer dressings. So the dressings could be left in place for as long as 10 days at a time. So that was much less painful for the men and a lot less time consuming for the staff. They first tested BIP in July 1916 on some of the first wounded men sent back from the Somme. And they published the results in the Lancet a few months later. But Endell Street was also famous for its homely atmosphere. Louisa Garrett Anderson believed that the men were often more wounded in their minds than in their bodies. So she insisted that the wards were airy and bright. They were painted in colourful paints. They had colourful bed quilts. They had armchairs and standard lamps and fresh flowers that were brought in daily. The courtyard, which had been this very grim, dark exercise yard from the workhouse, that was turned into a tranquil green haven with potted plants and striped umbrellas. And there the men could relax and listen to concerts or go to entertainments like the bank holiday fete in the photograph, where at those kinds of events, the men would be encouraged to invite their families. And that's why there's a little girl in the forefront of that picture. There was also a library with 5,000 books run by 2 women authors, which you can see in the photograph on the right, and a theatre which staged hundreds of entertainments. So they had magic acts, they had wrestling bouts, they had a pantomime every Christmas without fail. In all, there were more than 1,000 entertainers who visited every year. So you can imagine at times it must have been actually quite exhausting for the patients. And the men were also taught knitting and needlework in order to keep them occupied and to keep their minds busy. And some of that needlework still survives. So on the left, that's a shoe bag that was embroidered by a patient, and it's believed to depict Louisa, Garrett, Anderson walking their 2 dogs. And then on the right, that picture was handed down in the Anderson family. And on the back, there's a note which says it was embroidered by Walter Elmy with 1 arm. So he'd had 1 arm amputated and managed to embroider that. So although I've got an arm currently in plaster, I don't think I'm going to be doing any embroidery just yet. But despite all of these efforts to keep the men occupied and to keep morale high among the staff, it was obviously exhausting and often grueling work. On top of the long hours the women worked and the grueling wounds and sights that they had to put up with, and the terrible disabilities of the men that they were treating, the women were also coming under attack from air raids. There were Zeppelin raids on London from 1915, and some of those bombs fell very close to the hospital, including one huge bomb which actually fell at the bottom of Endell Street. It came through an air raid shelter, and some of those casualties came to the hospital for treatment. And then as the war ground on, there were food shortages and later rationing. And also Murray and Anderson were very strict disciplinarians who worked their staff very hard and demanded the highest standards. They had to be as tough as their male counterparts in order to run an efficient military hospital. Many of the staff were in awe of them. Many of them talked about actually being quite afraid of them. One orderly said they were told they had to be not only as good as men, but better. But even though they could be very severe, they did look after their staff. So they often sent their orderlies and their doctors away for a weekend to recuperate at the country cottage that the women that Flora and Louisa owned in the village of Penn in Buckinghamshire. But even though it was obviously tiring and exhausting and stressful, the impression I got most of all from doing my research was that the women also found it exhilarating, because they were doing something for the first time that they were good at. They were working together for a common cause, proving they were as good as men. Well, after the war ended, Endell Street stayed open for a further year to treat the victims of the 1918 influenza pandemic, the so-called Spanish flu. And really that was the darkest time for the staff, because throughout the war, they had saved thousands of men from death and disability through their efforts together. But they were no match against this invisible enemy, the flu virus. Of course, this was in the era before antibiotics. The pandemic killed between 50 million and 100 million people worldwide. And at the height of the second, the most lethal wave, which hit this country in November 1918, so the time of the armistice, nearly 30,000 people died in the UK in a single week. And at Endell Street, more patients died per week of the flu than died per week during the war. And of course, the flu affected the staff too. So at least 22 of the staff fell ill with the flu, and 4 of the women died from it. So as you can imagine, that affected Flora and Louisa very deeply. And at one point, Flora Murray, who had stayed utterly steadfast throughout the war, she broke down in tears. It was at the point when she had just been told that one of her nurses, who had looked like she was about to die from the flu, that she'd turned the corner. But Endell Street also trialled new methods to stop the spread of the flu virus, including the use of face masks and segregating the wards and screening the beds. So they were all new innovations at the time. The doors of Endell Street finally closed in December 1919, so just over 100 years ago. And the war had changed everything for women and nothing, because women had won the vote. In January 1918, women over 30 were given the vote. The women at Endell Street had proved that women could run a military hospital just as well as men, that women doctors, women surgeons were at least as skilled as their male counterparts. And yet the women doctors, in fact, all of the hospital's women staff, were now expected to go back to doing exactly the same roles they had done before. The medical schools, which had actually stayed open in London only because they admitted women students, now closed their doors to women again. The mainstream hospitals, many of which had also only managed to survive the war by recruiting women doctors to replace the men who'd gone overseas, they now refused to appoint women doctors again, and they sacked the women that were still working there. In fact, one woman doctor was appointed to a junior post at the London hospital, but she never started her job because the male doctors there said they would resign if she took her job. And so most of the doctors who had worked at Endell Street throughout the war and gained all that experience had to go back to treating only women and children, or retire or go abroad to work. And it was going to be many more decades before women doctors won equality in law, at least. I'm sure most women doctors will tell you that there's still a long way to go yet. Flora Murray and Louisa Garrett Anderson carried on working in medicine for a few more years, and then they had to close their children's hospital for lack of funds, and they retired to the countryside, to their cottage in Penn in Buckinghamshire. Flora died in 1923, so I think she'd really been worn out and worn down by her war work. She had a military-style funeral in the churchyard in Penn when they played the last post, and the then new head of the Royal Army Medical Corps attended in her honour. And then Louisa lived on alone for another 20 years. So in the Second World War, she did work briefly in a casualty department, but she died in 1943. And at that point, her name was added to Flora Murray's gravestone in the churchyard in Penn. So Louisa was cremated and her ashes were scattered, but her name was added to the gravestone, along with an inscription. And despite all of their trials, despite everything they had been through, all their battles, the inscription says, "We have been gloriously happy." Well, my book is a tribute to all the women who worked at Endell Street and all the men who were treated there. And I wrote it to give voice to them, but also because I think it speaks to us today, and especially today, although when I was doing my research, I had no idea that it might become even more relevant. But I think it speaks to us about the extremes of human endurance, of loss and pain and sacrifice, but also of dedication and perseverance and compassion, and the simple joy of being alive. And so thank you all for listening. I'm very happy to answer questions, and of course, if you want to know more about the hospital and all the incredible women who worked there, please do feel free to buy my book. Thank you very much.